In the 1950s, the US military tested a flying machine so strange, people genuinely thought it was a joke. It had no wings, no cockpit, no fuselage, no protection around the pilot at all. Just a man, standing on a tiny metal platform, balanced above a massive spinning fan. And somehow, this thing could fly. The first time people saw the Hiller flying platform, they didn't think they were looking at the future of aviation. They thought they were looking at an accident waiting to happen. Engineers questioned how it could possibly stay stable. Pilots assumed it would flip over the second it left the ground. Honestly, even by the standards of Cold War military experiments, the machine looked ridiculous. But then it lifted off. Slowly, the platform began hovering above the ground, not violently, not uncontrollably, smoothly. The pilot leaned slightly, and the machine drifted through the air almost like it was floating. No runway, no giant helicopter rotors, no complicated controls. Just a single person standing in the sky. And suddenly, the laughter started fading, because military officials immediately saw the possibilities. A soldier could fly across rivers, cross minefields, reach jungle clearings helicopters couldn't land in. For a brief moment, it looked like the United States might have invented something decades ahead of its time. And this is the part that makes the story even stranger. This happened in 1955. Nearly 70 years before modern drones, hoverbikes, or personal flying vehicles started appearing again. So why did the world abandon a machine that looked so much like the future? To understand why anybody built something this bizarre, you have to go back to the years right after World War II. Aviation was changing fast. Jets were becoming faster, helicopters were becoming more powerful, and militaries everywhere were obsessed with mobility. But helicopters still had a huge problem. They were expensive, mechanically complex, and incredibly difficult to fly. Training a helicopter pilot could take months. Maintaining the aircraft took entire crews, and in combat zones, even a small mechanical failure could become deadly. The US Army started wondering if there was another option. Not a better helicopter exactly, something smaller, simpler, maybe even personal. That idea eventually reached a young engineer named Stanley Hiller. And honestly, Hiller already had a reputation for thinking differently. He built one of his first helicopters as a teenager, became one of America's youngest aircraft designers, and founded Hiller Aircraft, while most people his age were still figuring out their careers. But Hiller believed aviation was still too complicated. In his mind, the future of flight wasn't giant machines filled with controls and instruments. It was something ordinary soldiers could use with almost no training at all, and that led him to one radical question. What if flying could become as natural as standing? At first, the idea sounded almost absurd. But over the next few years, Stanley Hiller and his team began building a machine that looked less like a helicopter, and more like something pulled from science fiction. Now, here's where the story starts getting really strange. Because the flying platform didn't work like a normal helicopter at all. Traditional helicopters rely on massive exposed rotor blades spinning overhead. Those blades generate lift, but they also create enormous torque. That's why helicopters need tail rotors in the first place, to stop the entire aircraft from spinning uncontrollably. And for pilots, flying one was anything but simple. Small mistakes could quickly become dangerous. Hiller wanted to remove as much complexity as possible. Instead of building a large helicopter around the pilot, he built a machine around a single giant ducted fan. The pilot simply stood on a platform above it. Beneath their feet, a powerful rotor pushed air downward through a circular duct, creating vertical lift. The surrounding ring wasn't just there for protection either. It actually helped compress and guide the airflow, making the system more efficient than an open rotor of similar size. But the most fascinating part was stability. At first glance, the flying platform looked wildly unsafe. Most people assumed it would instantly tip over in mid-air. But Hiller discovered something unexpected. Because the pilot stood above the rotor system, their body weight acted almost like a pendulum. As the machine tilted, gravity naturally helped stabilize it. In simple terms, the platform partially wanted to level itself out. That meant pilots didn't need advanced helicopter training just to stay airborne. And honestly, this is probably the moment military observers started paying serious attention. Because suddenly, the impossible-looking machine began sounding practical. The controls were surprisingly simple. The pilot leaned slightly to shift direction while using basic hand controls to manage thrust and movement. Instead of sitting inside an aircraft full of instruments, the operator almost became part of the aircraft itself. That idea sounded unbelievable in the 1950s. But somehow, against all common sense, it actually worked. By the mid-1950s, Hiller's idea finally became reality. The machine was officially called the Hiller VZ-1 Pawnee, although most people simply remembered it as the flying platform. And the moment testing began, reactions were almost impossible to ignore. Because this thing didn't just hop off the ground for a few seconds, it genuinely hovered. Footage from the time still looks surreal today. Soldiers stood upright on a small circular platform while the machine floated a few feet above the earth. Then slowly, it began moving forward, sideways, turning in place, drifting through the air with a level of control most people never expected. And honestly, seeing it in motion made the entire project feel even stranger. There was no cockpit protecting the pilot, no windshield, no seatbelt, just a person balancing above a spinning rotor powerful enough to lift both man and machine into the sky. Yet somehow pilots kept reporting the same thing. It was easier to control than they expected. That detail mattered enormously. One of the Army's biggest interests in the flying platform was the possibility that ordinary soldiers, not highly trained aviators, might eventually learn to operate it quickly. Compared to helicopters, the learning curve seemed dramatically smaller. And for military planners during the Cold War, that idea sounded revolutionary. Suddenly, people began imagining entirely new types of warfare. Recon scouts flying above jungle terrain, soldiers crossing rivers without bridges, rapid rescue missions in places too dangerous for larger aircraft, tiny flying machines carrying troops across rough terrain where vehicles couldn't go. For a brief moment, the flying platform stopped looking like a weird experiment. It started looking like the first step toward a completely different future. And that was exactly when the United States Army began taking the project far more seriously. For a brief period during the late 1950s, the flying platform genuinely looked like it might change military aviation forever. At the time, the Cold War was accelerating fast. The United States was obsessed with speed, mobility, and survival on future battlefields. Military planners feared wars fought in dense jungles, destroyed cities, radioactive terrain, and remote environments where traditional vehicles might struggle to operate. And suddenly, Stanley Hiller's strange little machine seemed to offer answers nobody else had. Unlike airplanes, it didn't need a runway. Unlike helicopters, it was tiny. A soldier could theoretically lift off almost anywhere. Small clearings, forest openings, narrow roads, rough terrain, places larger aircraft simply couldn't reach safely. That flexibility fascinated military strategists. The flying platform could hover low above the ground while remaining surprisingly maneuverable at short distances. Demonstration footage showed operators moving in different directions with a level of stability that shocked many observers. Even more surprising, the aircraft didn't feel as mechanically overwhelming as helicopters of the era. And this is where the dream started becoming much bigger than the machine itself. Some military thinkers imagined entire squads using personal flying platforms for reconnaissance missions. Others pictured battlefield messengers crossing dangerous terrain in minutes instead of hours. During an era obsessed with futuristic warfare, the concept felt almost limitless. Honestly, the flying platform looked like something straight out of a science fiction magazine from the 1950s. A single person hovering silently above the earth, carrying no wings, no runway, and almost no aircraft around them at all. But beneath all the excitement, problems were beginning to appear. The platform could hover well at low altitude, but its speed remained limited. Its operational range was short. Strong winds made control far more dangerous, and perhaps most importantly, the pilot was completely exposed. In an actual combat zone, even basic enemy fire could become catastrophic. The Army slowly realized something uncomfortable. The flying platform worked best in demonstrations, controlled environments, and short-range experiments. Turning it into a practical battlefield vehicle was far more difficult. Still, for a brief moment, people genuinely believed they were looking at the future of personal flight. But by the early 1960s, reality started catching up with the dream. The biggest problem wasn't that the flying platform couldn't fly, It absolutely could. The problem was that the technology of the era simply wasn't advanced enough to make the concept truly practical. Its engines were loud, fuel-hungry, and limited in power. The machine performed best close to the ground, but as conditions became more difficult, the risks increased fast. Strong crosswinds could destabilize the platform. Higher altitudes reduced performance. And while the aircraft looked stable during demonstrations, combat environments were far less forgiving. Then there was the issue nobody could ignore. The pilot had almost no protection at all. A soldier standing exposed above a giant spinning rotor might look futuristic, but on a real battlefield, it also looked incredibly vulnerable. Even small arms fire could become deadly, and compared to increasingly capable helicopters, the flying platform carried very little equipment, traveled short distances, and offered limited tactical flexibility. At the exact same time, conventional helicopters were improving rapidly. They became faster, more reliable, and more powerful with each passing year. Suddenly, the military no longer needed to gamble on such an unusual concept, and slowly, the excitement disappeared. The flying platform never entered large-scale production. What once looked like the future of personal aviation faded into a forgotten Cold War experiment buried beneath newer technologies. But honestly, that's what makes the story so fascinating. Because the flying platform didn't disappear because the core idea was impossible. It disappeared because the world around it wasn't ready yet. For decades, the flying platform felt like one of those strange dead ends in aviation history. An ambitious idea that briefly captured the imagination of the military before quietly disappearing into old photographs and black and white test footage. And then technology started changing. Small electric motors became dramatically more powerful. Batteries improved. Flight computers evolved fast enough to make unstable aircraft easier to control automatically. And perhaps most importantly, the rise of drones completely changed how people thought about vertical flight. Suddenly, hovering machines no longer sounded impossible. Modern aerospace companies began experimenting with personal aircraft again: jetpacks, hover bikes, compact eVTOL vehicles. And the similarities to Stanley Hiller's original vision started becoming difficult to ignore. Some modern designs even follow the exact same philosophy. Keep the aircraft small, simplify the controls, use compact vertical lift systems. Allow a single operator to maneuver in tight spaces without needing traditional runways or large support infrastructure. The difference is that modern technology can finally solve many of the problems Hiller couldn't overcome in the 1950s. Electric propulsion systems are lighter and more responsive. Digital stabilization can make hovering dramatically safer. Autonomous flight assistance helps correct pilot mistakes instantly, something engineers during the Cold War could barely dream about. And now, militaries around the world are once again exploring personal mobility aircraft for reconnaissance, logistics, and rapid movement across difficult terrain. Which is where the story starts feeling almost surreal, because the same idea people once laughed at, a single person flying on a tiny hovering platform, suddenly doesn't seem ridiculous anymore. In fact, it looks strangely familiar. The world may not have adopted Stanley Hiller's flying platform exactly as he imagined it, but nearly 70 years later, modern aviation is quietly moving back toward many of the same ideas that made his machine look impossible in the first place. Today, the flying platform still looks absurd. A man balancing above a spinning fan with almost nothing protecting him from the sky beneath his feet. Even now, it feels less like a real aircraft and more like a forgotten science fiction prop that somehow escaped into reality. And maybe that's exactly why the story refuses to disappear, because history is full of inventions people mocked before the world finally caught up to them. Electric cars once seemed impractical. Drones were once treated like toys. Even vertical flight itself sounded impossible before helicopters changed aviation forever. The flying platform never replaced helicopters. It never transformed warfare. And it never became the personal aircraft Stanley Hiller imagined. But in a strange way, that almost misses the point. Because long before modern hover bikes, compact eVTOL aircraft, or autonomous drones started filling headlines, Hiller was already chasing the exact same dream. A future where flying could become smaller, simpler, and personal. And nearly 70 years later, the aviation industry is still chasing it too. So maybe Stanley Hiller wasn't building a machine for the 1950s after all. Maybe he was building something the world simply needed more time to understand.